good, camera on, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this panel discussion. My name is Yolanda, Alleyne, as you know, and just to let you have a sense of how we're going to do this afternoon, I will start off by giving a bit of background to the legislation that we've come to discuss. We're here to discuss the new Planning and Development Act 2019 as amended and the implementation of that act. And then I will ask Christine Toppin-Allahar to give us some of the high points of the legislation, and particularly the things that are relevant to the construction and design industry. Then we'll open the discussion for questions, and all the panelists will then be available to ask or answer whatever your concerns are. I would just like to encourage you to keep your microphones muted so that we don't have any unnecessary interruptions. And I also would like you to use the chat box to ask your questions so that we can manage them from there. I also just would finally ask that we are in the front end of implementing a new piece of legislation, and I know some people are practitioners and probably interfacing with the department, the planning department, who is the main agency responsible for seeing its implementation through. I'm just asking you to be respectful in your discourse. We are all in a new season together, and we may have a number of teething issues as we put the new legislation into practice. So with that beside me or ahead of me, I would like to start off by just giving the background. So as you know, with any big event, there's always a backstory, and this new legislation is replacing a 60-year-old piece of legislation for town and country planning, which was passed in 1968. A few observations. In summary, that 1968 planning legislation had outlived its time. It was based on the UK legislation of the time, and it was not tailored really to the peculiarities of our island. It was implemented as it was at that time in Barbados, and we had it for what it was worth. And over time, the UK itself would have moved on from that type of planning and that type of planning system. And across the globe, you would have seen far more participation in planning, but we were stuck with a legislative framework and practice that was becoming less effective at keeping pace with the development that was taking place and with the sustainable development outcomes that people were calling for more and more. It is, though, I would like to make the point that back in the 70s and 80s, that very piece of legislation brought Barbados a lot of admiration and respect, because we had a very strong forward planning section, and we were able to produce national physical development plans, not one, but we had amendments to it, and repeatedly we were able to do that. And I don't know if there are any other CARICOM states that can claim to have had the number of national physical development plans that we had. And in fact, that framework for decision-making makes a big difference when you have it, because that's an integrated framework for the decisions that are being made, and it makes life easier in planning practice. So going back then to going beyond the 1990s now, we saw on the international pressure, the introduction of consideration of environmental effects of development. And so again, another layer is added to what we do in planning. And with limited resources put to the system, with a legislation that was becoming outdated, you start to see signs of limited accountability, inefficiencies, and limited transparency. And ultimately, people grumble, and there is a sense of dissatisfaction among practitioners and the developer public in more recent times. Now, I would have to say over the last 10 to 15 years, the Town Planning Society itself, and I'm the president of the Town Planning Society, as you were told, we had many seminars advocating for change, but the climate was not right for that. So here we have a new administration in 2018 coming on board, and with the pace and development being outstripped by the resources put to planning and investment, the current administration pretty much was compelled to answer the IMF, whom was now giving them large grants to change the legislation and bring into place demonstrate that there was an integrated framework for planning and development decisions. And so the change of legislation was in fact included in the Barbados Economic Recovery and Transformation Program. So when the government called, the Barbados Sun Planning Society, obviously because we've been advocating for some time, was ready and able to facilitate a wide consultation process. Many government agencies were there, all that are involved, as well as developers and practitioners, professionals like yourself that are involved in land-based professions. And a green paper was prepared, and that was a complex process in itself again, but we were all involved in it to bring about the required change. So that pretty much sets a background as to how we got to this point, where we're now looking at this new piece of legislation. And I know you stop and you think to yourself, what is the purpose of this act? And I just had to look back at the original 1968 Act, and which said the act was making provision for the orderly and progressive development of land in both rural and urban areas, and to preserve and improve the amenities thereof for the grant of permission to develop land. So pretty much that same purpose still stands. We are trying to manage land resources, the use of them, but we're also trying to do it in a particular way. So the new legislation, its purposes are split out. If you have read it, you will see that there are like 5 of them, and it's explicit, not about just managing the land and its resources and already developed, but saying how we're doing that. And it brings to the fore the whole notion of having sustainable and resilient outcomes. So you will see the one of the purposes here is a facilitation of land development in Barbados. That's what the act is for, taking into account all the relevant and social, economic, and environmental factors, the attainment of appropriate standards for land use and development, having standards in place, efficiency and accountability by public authorities whose function is to regulate and to use the development, participation of all concerned persons in decision-making, and effective access to administrative and judicial proceedings. There you see the principle behind the act being spelled out far more explicitly, and the act is actually bringing to the fore, holding us accountable, looking at transparency, making more things more accessible, and engaging a wider public than the old legislation would have. And the reason behind that is it has been shown that when people have far more participation in the process of decision making, the outcomes are more widely accepted, and in the long run, it is far more effective in bringing about the type of development that we want for the entire community. I know as sometimes as professionals, we may think on a site-by-site basis or a case-by-case basis, and think only at that point in time about what the client wants on this particular space. But planning requires way more than that. And I always like to, before I ask Christine to give us an overview of what is in the Act and the particular components that are relevant for the design and construction industries, just to remind you that planning itself is a very eclectic discipline. So it draws on all kinds of fields. It is looking at things spatially. So, and it's looking across different government systems, and it's looking at them over time. So they're looking at a site, you're looking at the site, you can't just make a decision for the site, you're also looking at the community, the neighborhood, the region, and nationally, how does it all fit together? That's why it's called integrated. So you're looking at not only that, you're looking at the environment, you're looking at preservation of heritage, there are all kinds of things that come into play, effects on the environment, not now, but cumulatively. So that joined up thinking is what the planner brings to the table. Hence, when you change a piece of legislation of this sort, it's like a taproot. The legislation does not sit on its own. It's supported by several other pieces of legislation. So when you look at the physical planning legislation, the planning development legislation, and it shifts, you then have to look at all the things that help it to be there, the things that look at our ecosystem, the regulations that relate to our ecosystem services and management, that look at our transport systems, the regulations for advertisement and aesthetics, the regulations for the coastal area, there's some public health, all those things come into play. So in shifting one piece, the main piece, which is the anchor for integration, you then also have implications for several other pieces. So it's actually a major task when we speak about implementation and its significance for the design and construction industry. But I leave you with that, and I before we open for discussion and as we go on, I'm going to ask Christine to give us a overview of the main components of the act and specifically what are the highlights for the design and construction industry. Christine, are you with us?
Yes, Yolanda, I'm here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And Yolanda just very eloquently went through what are the purposes of the act, you know, and in legislative drafting, they say that the act shouldn't promise more than it delivers. So actually the purposes here, you can see them brought out in some of the devices that we have in the act. One of the things that is very conspicuous if you have read through the new legislation is the change in the administrative framework. You know, in the past, this legislation spoke about the minister and the chief town planner. Now we have gone away from that sort of decision-making framework and having much more a collegial decision-making modality in it. So you find that we have introduced a board, and that board is a multidisciplinary board, partly made up of officials from the public service and partly made up from representatives of the professions and partly from the private sector. So the idea here is now to have a more, as I say, collegial, but also transparent decision-making process, because the records of the discussions and so on of the decision makers in that forum will be public records. But let me just take a step back and say that, of course, the legislation doesn't differ from the previous legislation in that the two central elements are the forward planning process and the development control process. But, and we've made some changes to the forward planning process, but it is true to say that the forward planning process in which Barbados was engaged, and I must say I agree with Yolanda, that there's nowhere else in the Caribbean that has the track record that Barbados has in terms of forward planning. But the important thing to note there is actually the practice of planning in Barbados was ahead of the legislation. The legislation didn't even call for all the bottom-up and participatory modalities that were in use. So all we've done there is to bring that part of the legislation abreast of modern planning practice, but also to introduce some new devices in terms of talking a bit about the status of the plan, for example, and its implementation. Because, you know, in the past, the mechanism, so to speak, for the implementation of the plan was primarily negative in the sense that the plan was used as a development control tool, although it's supposed to be a forward planning instrument. So we wanted to introduce some more positive aspects of having a national physical development plan. So that's in there about the status of the plan and so on, and that needs to be an ingredient in public sector investment and so on. And also there's some new provisions where in between the plan periods, for example, policies can be formulated and made official so that you'll have another suite of documents that will assist you in the work. When it comes to the development control process, as I mentioned, the board is going to be the principal actor in that area. But at the same time, there is still provision for certain classes of plans to be referred to the minister. But we have limited that in the new legislation to plans that are of national, strategic, economic, or environmental importance. So every little 2 acres of land and so on that used to have to go to the prime minister, that will no longer be the case. The fact is that there are a number of things, as Yolanda said, a number of things that need to be rolled out in order to operationalize this legislation. And that is one of the things that, as far as I know the document has been prepared, but as far as I know, the proclamation hasn't been made of the actual list of classes of cases that will go to the prime minister. So that is something that is in the works. So the board will be the primary decision maker, but the board also has the power to delegate certain classes of decisions down to the director of planning and staff. And that delegation order will also have to be made. I know it was under discussion. I don't know if it's been made, presumably there may be somebody here from planning who can inform us. But so let us put it this way: there's a reserve of very important cases of developments that the board cannot delegate, and they're in a schedule to the Act. But beyond those very major, if you want to call it major developments, the minor developments can be delegated to the staff of the department and decided at a staff level. Let me make it perfectly clear, though, that the professionals in the department will be doing the work of receiving, reviewing, and advising on the planning decisions to be made on applications, even the applications, of course, that are going to be going to the minister. We have also changed up the situation in terms of, and this is something very important, in the past, appeals had to be heard by the minister also. And that process under the old legislation had no transparency at all. You know, you could ask for a hearing, and then nobody knew what took place after you know, the exchange of documents and what advice was given on your applications and so on. So one of the major important changes in the Act is that we have introduced an administrative appeals tribunal. Now, this tribunal will be hearing appeals on the merits of planning decisions, decisions made by the board and by the officers, the staff of the department. So the idea of having a board of professional, a tribunal, where again, the decision is being made collectively by 3 or more persons, then, you know, you have this same idea of sharing of knowledge and responsibility. And one of the things is that you really, you know, people have asked a question. One of the things that have been put to me is about corruption. You know, there have been rumors about that sort of thing going on. And one of the reasons that we have made these, introduced these sort of collective decision-making modalities, both for the applications, but also for the appeals, is to put a stumbling block in the way or restrict the scope for personal corruption. Of course, there are other devices in the Act that actually go directly to criminalizing acts of corruption and so on. But the whole system is supposed to become more transparent, more collegial, and the sharing. Now, what in the actual process of the development control, we have introduced some stages where people can engage in much more consultation in advance. And also one of the things that has been done is to introduce some very tight timelines. So it is important for those consultations to take place before the applications are filed if you want the applications developed, decided expeditiously. Let me see now, the important thing from the point of view of the construction and design elements is that the initial version of the Act that was passed in 2019 did not include this one-stop shop option. And the decision was made afterwards. You know, when I say one-stop shop, at present, the planning decision is made at planning, and building plans have to go to public health, the EPD actually. And in addition, there is a system of referring the more complex plans to the Ministry of Works for review there in terms of the structural details. So one of the things that in order to make the process much more efficient, it was decided to bring all of these things in-house. Now you will understand, and when we're talking about implementation of this Act, that it will take some time, first of all, to retool the department just to handle the new planning development control process. But in addition, it has to be reconstructed and built up to be able to take on the responsibility for handling the building plan stage, so that the decision was made by the government not to proclaim the part of the Act that has to do with building plans, which is probably the one that is most central to architects and engineers that are involved in this, this discussion. But so that is all on the books, but it hasn't been rolled out. And my understanding is the reason is it hasn't been rolled out because the work has not been done. The administrative measures have not been taken to consolidate the skills of those three departments into one place. I think I've spoken the key points, I think, from the terms of radical change would be the change that decision-making is primarily going to be made by a multidisciplinary board, and appeals are not going to be appeals to the minister. They're going to be appeals to a properly equipped and run tribunal. Of course, you have your normal enforcement measures and so on. And what has we've tremendously upgraded, and we can't really spend too much time discussing every aspect of it, but the conservation of the natural environment and the built environment is greatly strengthened. And Yolanda also mentioned, I think, the whole question of amenity and the advertisement control and so on. So we'll take your questions as we go along, but basically I think that the whole philosophy informing the act, the new act, was different to the philosophy informing the previous act. I had a chat recently this week. We had a chat with the couple of the other panelists. And one of the observations we made is that when that act was brought in 1965, 66, whenever it was, the professional landscape in Barbados was completely different. If they had architects and engineers and planners, they would probably have been employees of the government at the time. Very few would have been in private practice. Now you have a healthy private practice in all of those professions. And therefore we can approach the whole question of the industry and of development control and development facilitation, as it's called in the new act, as in a completely different way, because we have partners, the officials in the public sector have partners in the private sector now who are quite up to scale in terms of being professionals in this field. So I'll hand back over to the chair, Yolanda.
Thank you, Christine. I haven't seen any questions yet coming up in the chat, so I'd like to throw out one that we had from before. Do you believe that there was enough tripartite discussions on the act before it was sent to Parliament? And Christine, before you weigh in, I would like to hear from Christian, who is representing the BIA, and Lieutenant Colonel Trevor Brown, who's also on the panel. I would like both of you to tell us what you think about the discussions that went on, if sufficient went on before the act was sent to, the bill was sent to Parliament.
Thank you, Yolanda. Yeah, well, I will say that I first got involved in all of these discussions soon after the elections in 2018. So, and there were many large meetings and roundtable discussions, and I think that it was vented to the nth degree at those meetings. So from an architectural point of view, from representation from the BIA, I can say that we were at the table and we were involved. So I do think in that respect, there was a lot of venting, the necessary venting taking place.
Thank you. Colonel Brown?
Well, good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for the opportunity. Well, I substantially agree with Christian's position that there was, in fact, extensive discussion. In fact, I, on behalf of the engineers, we offered congratulations to the organizers for the process that was undertaken to execute this project. But to be quite honest with you, this is so important and impressive that there could never have been enough consultation. And indeed, even though we did, I personally praise the organizers and the town planning department and Christine in particular for the professional approach that you brought to the process, for the level of involvement. If we were asked to identify a single weakness, it would be that there still has not been enough consultation. And this is even beyond your level, the whole question of public education, public awareness of how important this is and why it is important. So to that extent, I would have to say that, yes, there was a lot, it was well done, but there's still room where it could have been significantly better. And in fact, one of the things that we would like to see going forward is that this be used as a model and the learning from this project be used to impact change management in Barbados going forward.
Thank you, Colonel Brown. I haven't seen any questions yet from our participants. Just send them in the chat so we can see them. But you raised the whole issue of training and consultation and change and culture change almost. Do you and all of you, Christine as well, does change for the industries that are involved, because it is not just planning, it is all those who are involved in land-based professions. How would you go about that, and what do you think? Does it warrant it, and how?
If that's a major, I missed part of your, you cut off for part of your.
I'm
Yes,
sorry, I asked, does the app warrant training and culture change, and how?
Oh, well, before any, can I say that this Planning and Development Act to us in BAPE represents a major step forward in bringing greater professionalism to the important practice of national planning and development, the whole strategic direction that Barbados is going to take from a developmental point of view. So therefore, the level, I mean, we actually think that major efforts, similar to the developmental efforts that you made in the legislation, also needed and still need to be made across Barbados, not only to the professional groups, but to ordinary Barbadians. This act, in fact, seeks to, the basic problem is, and it goes without saying, that if you're going to have large numbers of different people sharing common resources on a little island like Barbados, there need to be some rules and regulation as to how we live together, and certainly how we develop together. I mean, I can't have a fellow go and build his toilet right next to my kitchen. That will only lead to conflict and problems. And this act seems to come up with a sensible developmental path towards avoiding those sort of conflicts. This certainly warrants high quality professional leadership. And we saw that with the legislation. And all I'm saying is that, yes, in answer to your question, we need to see that across the professional groups, across the social groups, as part of the school system, so that everybody understands this important aspect of forward planning and planning by prevention. This is the way the world is in the 21st century. We can no longer depend on trial and error. We can no longer wait until somebody build a $10 million plan to suddenly realize that there are serious environmental problems. We now have to solve those problems proactively. And I think that what this particular act goes a long way. I mean, it's, I must tell you, Dr. Alleyne, that I'm disappointed to hear that the reason we did this is because of the IMF. I would like to have thought that we did this because we recognize that this is what is needed if we're going to seriously talk about taking Barbados forward. But even so, I still think there's the opportunity for us to actually make the most of this, but it is going to involve a lot more discussions like this. And I'm glad that we have people like you and Christine who can actually lead us in discussions.
If I could, Yolanda, I think that's a slight misrepresentation in that this process started from the manifesto of the present government in that election in 2018. And it was a commitment that they made in the manifesto to address this whole question of the efficiency in development approvals process and so on. Construction permitting, I think it was called, because Barbados was getting some very bad reviews internationally in terms of the length of time it was taking. And that was a commitment the government gave at that time. And I believe it was because we had embarked on that process that it was possible for the government to work it into the agreement with the IMF as one of the benchmarks eventually, saying this is what we're doing and this is what we undertook to do and so on, and make it part of the BERT. I don't think the BERT made it happen. It happened and then the BERT followed. But I want to agree with Colonel Brown in terms of, we know that the stakeholders that we engaged with, and there were many, as Christian said, in large and small meetings over the course of a couple of years. I think everybody got on the same page and understood what it was all about and so on. But we know from some of the call-in programs and the feedback, even a debate in Parliament, in the Senate in particular, that without a proper what he called public awareness situation, that there has been a misunderstanding of elements of this legislation. And in particular, a misunderstanding of the whole part that actually is not enforced yet, the one-stop shop part about the building plans, there's been quite a bit of misunderstanding about that. So we really need to probably roll out elements, maybe pull out elements of this, this package of legislation. And when I say we, I mean the persons who are now responsible for it need to probably do some, of course, they have to do internal training too. Let's not forget that, because there are a number of people to be retrained now in the newly old system. They've got to be trained in the new system because that is also a culture change for the organization that's involved. But also I think they're to get out to the public so that some of the misapprehensions that people have about some aspects of this legislation are cleaned up.
Thank you, Christine. Christian, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, in terms of change of culture and whatnot, one of the underlying objectives of this legislation was to move a lot of responsibility into the private sector, into the engineers, in the hands of the engineers and the architects and whatnot. This is all wrapped up in Section 44, so it hasn't been proclaimed yet, but when proclaimed, there'd be a lot of responsibility and related liability in the private sector for implementing rules and regulations and ensuring the standard of construction in Barbados. So I think that is a positive thing, and I think that is also where, although we have a number of trained professionals, there's going to be a lot of work needed to do in learning and implementing building codes that we have, and it will essentially be raising the bar of the professional responsibility and activities of the architects and engineers in the area.
Thank you, Christian. Still haven't seen any questions coming through, but Christine, could you give us a little bit of background to the whole, the heightened role of the registered professional under the new legislation? What is driving that?
Yes, I'm seeing a question coming in right now. Just let me have a look at it. Yes, the question is asking if the appeals tribunal will be different from the board. Let me take that first,
Okay.
Yolanda, and then I'll talk about the registered professional. The board is being appointed by the minister, except that some of the members of the board are ex officio members, representatives, for example, of coastal zone and so on. And then there is selection of persons from the professions that I think has been done. As it is here, we have the president of the planners, which is Yolanda, and Colonel Brown and Christian my understanding is, are all on the board now. And then there are representatives from the private sector. And there's some talk in the act about consultations that the minister should make with the various stakeholder groups before making those appointments. The tribunal is quite different. The tribunal will be appointed by, now the president of Barbados, it was Governor General in the text, obviously, but the Governor General is now the president. So on the advice of the minister. So the minister will be given the advice, and this is quite a common device in the Constitution, as you would know, to the president. And that tribunal will be of separate people. They're nothing to do with the board, absolutely nothing to do with the board. And the tribunal will be a tribunal of, I believe, 9, no more than. And from that tribunal, different panels will be selected to hear different appeals. The point being that there will be panels of 3. And the idea here is that it will not be known in advance who is going to hear your appeal. If you're making an appeal, then a tribunal of 3 will be picked, a panel of 3 will be picked from the tribunal to hear your appeal. One of the reasons we're doing this, and I presume this thing is being recorded, yes. So I have to be very careful what I say. But once a prominent secretary in another Caribbean country said to me that we have a problem in the Caribbean that people mistake responsibility for power. You give them a responsibility and it becomes a vehicle for power. So what we wanted to do is actually shift things around. So we didn't create positions of power. within the legislation. And so what we are having now is a level of transparency as to what takes place, so that you know, different people will be hearing different appeals, and it will be limited predictability. You will know who the appellate panel are, the whole tribunal, but you will not know who the panel here in your appeal is until the panel has been selected. So so the tribunal is quite different from the board. There are two different vehicles. Now, I am not aware as to whether or not the appeals tribunal has been appointed yet. I know the board has been appointed. Yolanda, concerning the point you raised about the registered professional, I made the point earlier that when the old legislation was brought into force, you didn't have these registered professionals in Barbados, the organizations and the boards and that ran those organizations and so on. Now that we have that, we can see where a measure of responsibility for guaranteeing standards in the area of construction and design and planning as a whole can be transferred from the public sector to the private sector so that we can be partners in the process. As Christian alluded to, that is going to be a huge difference as to what takes place at present. It will not only expedite matters, but it will also allow people to show their expertise and rely on the expertise of their consultants. It's not only in the area of the construction and design that registered professionals will be certifying plans and so on. They are, you know, we've had a practice in the past of the permitted development schedule to the development order. I'm sorry to get so complicated, but permitted development was something that you didn't have to apply for planning permission. It was development, so you required permission, but permission was granted by the Act. And in the past, people had the practice of when they wanted to do this, and suppose they wanted to get funding from a bank, for example, they had no planning permission document because planning permission was not required for them to get it that way. But they used to go to planning to get a certificate to say that this, and this was not in the legislation, this was something invented by solicitors. So what we have done now, that of course made a lot of extra work for planning that was not part of their original mandate. So what we've done, for example, we've allowed in the new legislation for registered professionals to certify even that something is permitted development rather than having to go and trouble people down in the planning office. So a registered professional will be able to give you a certificate that you can take to a bank.
Thank you, Christine. I think there's a follow-up question from Neil about the tribunal and how it works in terms of having a number of persons permanent, and then from that you select. Can you see it?
Yes, I can see it. Yes, that's exactly it. There will be 9 people appointed to the tribunal. Of course, there will be a head of that tribunal, right? Let's call it like the Chief Justice, for example, and that person will do the assignment of 3 and 3 and 3, right? As the case goes through. So they will be rotated. The responsibility will be rotated amongst the 9, if I could put it that way, in panels of 3. But it will all be determined internally in the tribunal. It would not be the minister, for example, or the president pulling out those 3 people to hear your appeal. It will be all internal.
I'm wondering about this whole issue of transparency and access to information. I know that sometimes in the past that has been a challenge. People want to perhaps do environmental studies, or they want to do something and there's information there, but they have no access to it. Or even as in some jurisdictions where you can go online and see the planning history for a site that you're interested in. Christine, can you speak a bit more about that whole element that is being introduced into the current system in terms of transparency?
Yes, well, you know, in the past, the only transparency device that really in the legislation, when I'm talking now about the development control system, was the planning register, right? And that was literally a book that was a sort of a 1-sentence description of the application was put in the register. Some time ago, there was a case in Nevis, and actually the whole question arose in that case as to whether a person was limited under the existing legislation of only looking at this book, or were they entitled to look at the plans and the EIA and all that sort of thing and so on. Fortunately, Nevis had got some modern legislation themselves not long before Barbados, and has similar purposes about how the legislation must be interpreted and so on. And the Court of Appeal, Eastern Caribbean Court of Appeal, held that you were entitled to look behind the register book and get more particulars of the application and so on. So we have actually institutionalized that now into this new legislation, where there'll be complete transparency concerning applications. And one of the things that has been provided for is for the department to have a website, and that these things will be accessed through the website. We also put into the legislation a clause that brings the material that is in there, for example, EIA studies and so on, within an exception from the Copyright Act, so that once it becomes part of a public record, it's not governed by the same rules under the Copyright Act. So that we've made that expressly clear here. So I think there'll be much more access to information. Also, for example, in the tribunals, the tribunal will have to give their decisions in writing, and all those decisions and so on will be public information. Likewise, the minutes of meetings of the board will also be public documents. So I think that a number of transparency devices are in there to make sure that not only is good administration being practiced, but it's being seen to be done.
Thank you, Christy. And just a word of caution, although those things are in the legislation, remember that we are setting it up and getting it to work like that. That will take some time before we get there. So don't jump on the Town Planning's website tomorrow and say you didn't see anything about the applications that came in last week, please. We haven't got there yet, but that's what the legislation is making provision for, all of that. So we're still stepping on it. Is this another? Neil has asked something else, Christine. He's asked about issuing planning approval to projects in permitted development areas. Remember you spoke about it, you said a certificate, but it was a letter that people would go to get from the town planning to take to their financial agencies and say it was in fact meeting all the standards. So Christine, you can probably answer that for Neil. Yes,
no, the architects and engineers are not issuing the planning approval. The planning approval is actually, let me start by saying that the legislation approaches the whole question of planning and what is required for planning approval by saying there are certain things, three limbs as we've always known them, the building, engineering, mining and other operations, material change of use, and the subdivision of land. Those are the three things. And then they go on in the definition to expressly say some of these things, right, are not, do not require planning permission, and they accept them out of that category. But then you're left with a whole number of things that would constitute development, but they're so minor you don't want to trouble the bureaucracy with them. So then the planning legislation has this other device of giving the permission by the order, right? So it is not that things that are in the political permitted development schedule need an architect or engineer or planner's permission. The permission has been given by the minister by making the order, right? So they're permitted in advance. And the only way that the registered professional will be coming in is to certify for the purposes of a financial institution or any other reason why you want some kind of document to say the thing I did was permitted development and I don't need to show you a planning permission. I hope that's clear.
Thank you, Christine. I hope so too. I know the term permitted development is used quite a lot in the planning department, but people may not be clear. It's permitted through the order. It means it does not require formal application, and the professional is just coming in and saying, I can confirm that these things fall in the schedule where they would not require a formal application to the town planning department.
Yes, I could say in my experience, Barbados is the only place where that system of people running to planning to get some verification that something is permitted development. I've not seen it in any other jurisdiction.
There comes some, I think, a request from the financial agencies. Christian, you had something to add to that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, that all the classes of permitted development are clearly set out in, I don't know what the right terminology is, in that order or whatever that's been published. And all this sort of information will be carried on our BIA website. So it is all clearly laid out. So the architects and engineers can refer to the document to establish what is permitted development.
Yes, the new development order has been gazetted, so it is enforced with the permitted development schedule. And the other thing about permitted development, of course, is that the permitted development is described in one column of the schedule, but there are some conditions subject to which the permitted development, just as if you had gone in and applied. You could be given permission subject to conditions. So it is with permitted development. The minister has granted you the permission in advance, but subject to the conditions that are in the right-hand column.
Thank you for that, Christine. Colonel Brown, did you have anything to add on the whole issue of permitted development?
No, I'm quite happy with what we've discussed on that.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? I don't see them in the chat. We talked about transparency and the fact that a lot more information will now be available on the department's website. The decisions have been made, the reasons, all those things will be publicized, board meeting minutes and tribunal minutes. How about the issue of participation? Because that's one that has been a little limited in the past, and now there are new mechanisms to getting people more engaged in the process. Some of our practitioners here are involved in very big projects, some in very minor projects, but there are, in fact, junctures in the process where you have to engage the public. Could you, Christine, speak to some of that for us?
Yes, Yolanda, you know, we have put full provisions for environmental impact assessment in the new legislation. It was a simple sentence that had been added in to the old legislation when the Coastal Zone Management Act was passed some years ago. And so it was really, the whole system was rather woolly, if I could call it that, and depended a lot on guidelines. There were no regulations. Now we have a full statement in the legislation about EIA, and there are EIA regulations, and those regulations have also been gazetted and therefore are enforced. So the EIA regulations do provide for that public participation at various stages of the EIA process. There is the stage, of course, of setting the terms of reference. Then it's actually during the actual execution of the EIA study that you may be required to have community meetings and so on. And also finally, when the report comes out, it must be published for public comment at that stage and brought back then to the decision makers. But we have not limited public participation only to the cases in which an EIA would be required. There's provision in here in the new act for a certain amount of publicity to be given to other classes of applications, including applications that will be going to the Prime Minister, or rather I should say the Minister. It happens to be the Prime Minister in Barbados, but this is, the act doesn't foresee that it has to be the Prime Minister. But actually, you know, having planning in the Prime Minister's office is a very important, if I could just give my personal opinion, a very important aspect of what Barbados has done over the years, because planning is, as Yolanda was making the point, a cross-cutting activity that must be woven together, integrated from various different threads of public administration. It's very important that it should be at the center of the administration. And so I think that is one of the reasons that planning has worked so well in Barbados, and it has not been peripheralized, that has in many other countries pushed off into some ministry that may or may not be a punishment post for some minister that's out of favor. So here you have in Barbados, it's at the center of the government scheme. But now we are going to introduce a whole number of other different reasons for publicity. And for example, I think, if I'm not wrong, that my recollection is that we have also provided that when you get your planning permission and so on, you have to put it on the site. There'll have to be a sign on the site so that people who are bypassers and are curious about what is taking place and so on could go and look it up and find out the facts. So there are a number of situations in which there will have to be publicity and public comment, and people will be able to make objections, even objections to applications that are going to the minister for decision.
Thank you, Christine.
Dr. Alleyne?
So, Colonel Brown?
Yeah, could I would ask Christine to follow up on that point with the question of presumed acceptance. This seems to be a culture change from the old way where it was tended to be more confrontational. And I get the impression that the intent under the new act is that there is a presumption of acceptance. Now, how does she see that coming about? How do we go about getting people to change from this confrontational approach to planning to the kind of approach, even the whole question where it is possible now to go into the office beforehand for consultation, even before you actually formally present your application? How are we going to get our professionals to actually understand this new culture, and what is the proposal for bringing that on board?
Well, I think that a number of administrative mechanisms have to be put in place. And one of the things is that, of course, you have to tackle the fact that you're going to have to pay fees for some of these things. You're going to have to pay fees with regard to the advice received from the department, because, you know, people's salaries have to be paid. Just you know, government is not in this for fun. So there has to be an element of cost recovery. So some of these additional services that will be provided will have to be paid for in the application fees. There will be application fees for at various stages. But I think it's a very important point. And I must say that the presumption in favor of planning permission, which is what you're speaking about, is actually written into the wording of the act now, right? And that was a very important thing that the Prime Minister wanted that in there. And the fact that the first sentence about purposes is about facilitation of land development in Barbados, that philosophy informs that. And there are two important things. One is that we have actually written into the legislation this presumption in favor of development approval. So in other words, if there is no good reason why you shouldn't get yes, it's all about getting to yes. And we have a second device in there, and it was the brainchild of the Prime Minister, I will tell you. I only found the formula of words to bring it into reality. And that is that you are not going to get an outright refusal just so blanketly. You will get something called a provisional refusal, right? And that provisional refusal, Prime Minister was very keen on having a thing like that, where you're told, look, we can't approve your application as it stands now, but these are the things that you can do in order to get to yes, right? And so you get this provisional refusal. And if you are not prepared to make the changes, then that will crystallize into an absolute refusal. But if you are prepared to address the issues that planning is saying, look, I want to get to yes, but we have some stumbling blocks. Then if you're prepared to do that, then your provisional refusal will become an approval. It may be a conditional approval, but it will become an approval. And of course, we also have replaced the outline approval process with an approval in principle process, so that the approval in principle process is going to be somewhat simpler. If you want to, it's a separate process, and it is allowing you to have a document that will say that you will be getting the yes. Again, the approval in principle could be conditional, and you can also have a request for a certain level of environmental impact assessment at the approval in principle stage. So for example, in the old system, you had to have a full application before somebody started talking about EIA. Now you come with a concept. You only have conceptual plans, and you come in and you say, I want approval in principle. And they said, look, we can't get our heads around that unless you give us a certain level of environmental analysis. And so that can happen too. And that's also in the EIA regulations. So that by that point, you know, there may be cases in which, and we have allowed for that, the board feels that there's not sufficient information at the approval in principle stage to grant that. And they said, look, we're going to have to wait until you're further down the road in conceptualizing your project. So there are a number of steps that we've put in there that will allow people to get the bang for their buck, so to speak, as they go along professionally.
Thank you for that, Christine. We have a couple of questions in the chat. One is for clarity about permitted development, the fact that they can build, can you right now build without formal permission from the town planning department? I think maybe Christine can explain how the permitted development relates to residential uses, and also providing, of course, there's no condition where you are saying that you cannot carry it, because there are some subdivisions where when you got your permission to develop, it said no further development can be carried out without the permission of the chief town planner at that time. That's what it would say. In which case you couldn't then use the guidelines that are set out in the permitted development schedule.
If I can just jump in there, I think for clarity, I think what the question is, I mean, there are developments that are referred to as SL8s. I don't know what the right terminology for those are.
It's a standard letter.
Right. So this is what I think the question is, where a development, falls under this SL8 approval. They're looking at it being a permitted subdivision development area, as opposed to the, what's laid out in the schedule of permitted development. So it's two different things.
Well, I got the impression that is being asked, and I may be wrong, but I got Kevin was saying I can build within permitted development without formal permission. So in other words, I can build just where you're saying, Christian, where there is no clause saying no for development, even though it's an approved subdivision, it excludes that condition that says there can be no further development. It has to exclude that, because there are some formal subdivisions and all the lots say that. So everybody has to go back. And that defeats the purpose.
I think what is happening here is a little confusion in concepts, right? When we talk about permitted development and permitted development schedule, we're talking about a whole suite of different types of development: residential, industrial, commercial, and so on. And they're all numbered in different parts of the thing. When we say,
Christine, to be clear, under the current general development order.
Yes, exactly, okay. and so on. So when I say a permitted development, that's what I'm talking about. One that's in the permitted development schedule, not something that has been granted planning permission. So when this person is asking the question, can I now build within a permitted development without a formal applicant? That's not what we're saying at all, right? What the person seems to be understanding is that we are talking about a development which has been permitted, right? And that you can go ahead and build inside of that without permission. No, that's not what we're saying. We're saying that when we say that you can do permitted development and get that certified by a registered professional, it is one of the development classes that is in the development order.
Well, that's clear. Kevin, is it Kevin? Yes. Neil.
So I think it'd be useful if people could look at that schedule in the permitted development order, because it deals with things like additions to houses and that kind of stuff. It's not full-fledged build from scratch type development.
No, it'd be healthy to go through it and see where it, thank you. I think it was clear where it applies, so that you get a clearer notion of how it's actually applied in practice. I thought I saw something else there, but I've lost it.
I'm seeing a question again is in the portal. There are two categories right now: formal application and permitted application.
Oh.
Okay, I'm not sure what is in the TCPO portal. I can't answer those questions.
He's saying that on the town planning website it says a permitted development application. As I think, and it's the same standard letter that they're referring to. With the language is confusing because it's suggesting that you're making an application for something when in fact you just want a letter confirming that it in fact meets the required standards of that would not require formal application.
Yes, the old law was that when you were going to do a form of permitted development that was in schedule to the order, you had to notify the chief town planner. It was not an application, it was a notice that you had to give to the chief town planner. And then that you followed up that by asking him, I've given you notice, so you could come and see that I set out the permitted development. So it wasn't that you were asking for the permission, but you were notifying and then they had to verify. So that stage is now out. You're no longer required to do that. If the thing is, as Christian said, an extension to a dwelling house and so on, once you follow the parameters that are in the law, you can go ahead without notifying the chief town planner or anyone else. The director as it is now. Neil has his hand up, Yolanda.
I see Neil's hand up. Neil, do you have a question? Or do you have a statement? I just before you unmute Neil, I think there was a question by somebody earlier. I don't remember what it was about getting advice in writing from the town planning department when you have the pre-application consultations. And yes, it would be a formal process when they get to that point where you're required to have a meeting with the staff and other agencies, and it would be noted and formally the results will be sent back to you. So yes, that would be also be in writing. Yes, he has a question. Go ahead with your question, Neil.
I think you may need to unmute him because he's not a host.
I can't unmute. The host would have to unmute him. We were trying to avoid the long.
Hey,
the question.
Hi, my question was just answered. No, it was regarding to where you go and get consultation from the planning authority. I just want to be certain that they would put it. Someone has to put it in writing, otherwise,
Yes,
that advice is really not worth.
It would be in writing. As I keep saying, we are not there yet, but when we get there, it will be in writing. It will be a formal part of the process. Because remember, under the legislation, there's a clock ticking. There are timelines under which we are trying to get decisions to happen quicker. And so that becomes a part, and that's to reduce that, because if you come to the consultation meeting, then with the consultative agencies, all of them, not just town planning, then it helps the person who's making the application to know what all the concerns are from upfront before you make the application. That's to cut down time.
Great, thank you.
Okay,
and Neil, under the section that we're talking about, which is section 24, the consultations before applying, subsection 4 says that where an application is made after you've done those consultations, right? The fees that you paid for the consultations can be offset against the fee for the application, okay? So you're not paying twice. It would be a staged payment then.
That's good to know. Thank you for that, Christine. Very good to know. Liability, it seems that most liabilities on engineers and architects. What liability is on the government? Christine, I think that question could go to you first, and then the others can add in.
Well, I think that in terms of one of the objectives of this act, in fact, is to share liability with the people. At present, in any case, liability falls on architects and engineers, professional liability, and most architects and engineers will have professional liability insurance and so on, and that is for the integrity of your work. In terms of the process, certainly the case law has been that the government is only liable if there are approved plans that were done by a non-professional. Just excuse me a moment. So the liability for plans that were prepared by a professional has always been with a professional. But I don't know in terms of what you mean that most liability for what? For failure of the building, in terms of that. We had, of course, the famous case here in Britain's Hill. Is it Britain's Hill? Where a number of people died
Yes,
when there was a geological yes. When there was a geological issue. So yes, the government wants to avoid an open sesame situation where the government is going to be held liable for other people's failings, professional failings.
Thank you, Christine. There's a question. Does the new Planning Act change the requirements for rainwater storage, particularly in residential development? I know the general development order supporting that somewhat.
Yes, that has been changed completely. There may be some change still to be made, but what we're providing in the new development order is that the minister will be making a directive concerning that. So the old requirements about rainwater storage gone into abeyance for the time being, because no directive has been given about rainwater storage, because the government is of the view, and the Prime Minister had said so, I think, in one of the budget speeches, and we have put it in the new development order, that potable water storage is required now for every household. And of course, we are in a situation in Barbados where that has become increasingly necessary. And of course, we have had some emergencies over the last year, particularly where it was necessary for people in their households to have a certain amount of resilience in terms of water supply. So the emphasis has been placed now on portable white water storage. And it was felt that it was not astute or probably not affordable, not necessary to ask people to have portable water storage and rainwater storage, right? Especially as in Barbados, the position has been that stored rainwater has not been able to be used for domestic purposes in the past. So that they are still looking at the question, and a document was recently prepared on that, of the question as to what will be the new policy on the rainwater storage. But the development order at present talks about potable water storage and requirements for potable water storage, and leaves the power with the minister to make future provisions concerning rainwater storage.
So Christine, just for clarity there, that it's just silent on the question of rainwater storage?
There's a paragraph that says that the minister will make a statement.
Okay. So to what you were saying earlier, then the current requirement for rainwater storage is no longer in place.
No longer in place.
New applications need not include it.
Correct. If you want to make rainwater storage as I think it's a good thing. Personally, I think it's a very good thing to have. But I think the government felt that it was unreasonable to ask people to have two sets of water storage tanks. So the decision would have to be made as to whether you could mingle potable water with rainwater and use it for domestic purposes. Because to ask people to have two tank farms in their yard is a bit much. And it was felt that it was more important for people to have rainwater storage for a household, potable water storage for a household. So there's actually a dimension that is in the new development order as to the amount of household water storage.
Christian, you had something to add to that, or Colonel Brown?
Well, I'm just interested to see what happens at the submission of planning approvals at this stage, and because it's been a regular requirement since the mid-90s, I believe. So I'm just wondering if the planning department is actually aware of this, and if they're going to continue to require it in any event in conditions.
Well, yeah, they were involved in all the discussions about the new development order. So presumably, certainly at the top, they're very much aware of these changes.
Thank you. Are there any other, what about water storage for commercial and industrial projects?
As far as I recall, we don't have specifics of that in the development order.
Not in the order. So presumably there'll be guidelines being given by Water Authority through the planning department, I would think.
Yes, as I say, there's some research work still going on vis-a-vis the water, which is why we left sort of an open window in the development order for the minister to give directives.
Yeah, I really do recall that there was still work being done at Water Authority in terms of what was the appropriate policy approach to take. So I think it's evolving. So it will probably settle itself very shortly.
Yes, and as far as I recall, the rainwater storage requirements that were in the previous development order were actually standard conditions for permitted development. They were condition number 9, if I could remember, in the list of standard conditions. So they actually should only have been applied to permitted development, but they seem to have been imported into all development. So again, it is the way that the legislation in the past was read was to some extent inaccurate. but that has been done away with. That has been done away with the rainwater storage at the present time. You may learn in future that the minister has come to a resolution with the water authority concerning this, and there will be a directive.
So I think the thing is to stay tuned in terms of what is emerging from the Planning and Development Department with respect to that specific policy, and particularly as it relates to commercial and industrial projects. I think there's still a space there to be filled.
As you would understand, and I think Yolanda made this point earlier, this is new legislation. The department has to be brought up to speed. Lots of subordinate legislation needs to be made. Some of it has been done. The only two pieces that have been actually gazetted are the development order and the EIA regulations. But there are other pieces in the works. In fact, the use classes order has been finished but not gazetted. So, and then there would be the advertisement control and so on. And of course, the fee regulations, very important. So there are a number of things that need to be done to supplement the act itself. But in addition to that, there is a whole question of retooling the administration to handle these new responsibilities.
Yeah, so essentially what Christine is saying is that the implementation process is one that's going to take some time, as gradually we move from an old system where we now have to retrain people for new jobs and into this new system that the act is making provision for.
Yes.
So we have to be patient with that.
And I think it's important to remember too that the present government has taken, even before COVID, the position that we will go digital by default, right? And so the COVID pandemic has actually helped us push along that route. So one of the things that we will be doing is much less paper and much more online. I think that so that in itself is a major change for any department to have to handle, to move their systems over from a paper system, onto a totally electronic system.
Thank you for that. Anyone else wants to comment on that implementation change that's going to be happening? Digital issues? Where can we find the detailed planning act for my own perusal? This is the
yes, well, that is actually, if you go on the website of Parliament, right, you will find it is actually in two documents, right? There was the one, Act number 5 of 2019, which is the original act, and then there is an amendment act that was passed in 2020. It was passed on the 23rd of March 2020. So 2 years ago. So these two pieces of legislation have actually not been consolidated into one document yet, but I've had a recent discussion with, I think was the chair of the Planning and Development Board, and they are working hard on getting a single text where these things are, because it's very difficult for lay people to have to work with two texts, one that is amending the other.
Yes. So did you get any sense of how close we are to making that happen, Christine? Because I think it is actually quite cumbersome looking at the two pieces of legislation, the main thing, and then all the bits that are amended, because there are a lot of amendments.
No, I would say that it seems to me that the urgency is understood.
Okay. Thank you. And the legislation is also available on the Planning and Development Department's website. Thank you for that, Fabian. Thank you. Any other questions? If not, we can look at this whole issue of measures in the Act for the prevention of corruption. Christine, that is, do you think there are enough measures there, and are there any suggestions for revisions? What measures are in place?
Well, I would say two things. One is that there are direct measures in there. It's section 103 of the legislation, raises the issue of corruption to a new level. But it's not only about public servants who could be corrupted financially and otherwise. And, we live in a society of great intimacy where corruption doesn't have to be financial. It could be influence peddling or what have you. So we have written some very serious crimes into the legislation in section 103. And those crimes not only they not only apply to the recipient of the bribe, but the person who is offering the bribe. so that a person from the private sector who is trying to wield the grisly wheels of progress by corrupting a public officer will also be very liable to serious punishment. So those direct things, but of course, you know, punishment of that kind, those measures can only fix the problem after the fact. You have to allow the corruption to take place and then prosecute. So that is the direct measures that are in there, but we have a number of indirect measures which are supposed to be in the act in order to prevent us reaching that stage where somebody has been corrupted and has to be prosecuted. So when I say indirect, it is the whole philosophy of the act, this collegial decision-making, the transparency, all of these measures that are in there are, amongst other things, to prevent corruption. It will be very difficult, as I see it, under the system that we are created on this act, for any sort of shady deals to be taking place at any point of the application process and decision-making process. I mean, the board is, Yolanda, you could probably remember better than me because you're on the board, but the board is quite a substantial body of people. Just looking back here.
I can't remember the numbers, 11 or 12 persons, I think. I can't remember.
Yeah, it's quite a large board. Let me just see if I have it here. The chief town planner and 12 persons, right? So 13 people in all, a chairperson, 4 ex officio members, 1 person from the National Trust, 2 people from the professions, and 4 people from the legal or financial or private business and so on. So it's quite a large board. So I think that again, as I say, you know, at the appellate level, you're going to have a collective decision-making process also. So all of those things are actually intended, together with the transparency, the keeping of records of people having access to the discussions and the reasoning for decisions. All of that is indirect measures for preventing corruption.
Thank you, Christine. Anybody has any comments? Christian or Colonel Brown?
What I would say is, from our perspective, is that I think that the act goes a long way in dealing with that issue of corruption. We're very impressed with the way it is laid out, and it's very proactive in seeking to deal with that. The question, of course, is the implementation, that these things actually work. I mean, you know, and this is the challenge that we actually still face. So while a lot of positive work has been done in laying the foundation by putting the act in place, by actually having the laws passed and proclaimed, that's great. So the challenge that we see now is actually bringing these things to reality and to work. And you mentioned, Chair, that we're in the change process now. And I actually think that a lot more emphasis needs to be placed on coming to an end position where the outstanding intentions outlined by Christine, for example, and clearly documented in the act, actually come to fruition, and that practitioners can actually expect the results that we've been promising. That is when I will be very, very comfortable. But there's no question that the intent and the letter of the legislation is actually quite impressive.
Yes. So, but your view is that we need to be a bit more aggressive in terms of the resources we put behind the whole implementation process to make that change happen in a timely
make sure it actually happens. The other thing is that we are very happy with the extent to which it brings a new level of professionalism to what we do in planning. This was long overdue, and I'm actually glad that Christine clarified for me the reason we actually did it. But this is long overdue. It is a positive step, and I think that in itself goes a long way in actually dealing with corruption. The whole question that you're bringing people who stake their professional careers on the results and on integrity, and particularly on transparency. I am so impressed with the fact that everything, including the minutes of the board meetings, for example, will be documents that will be available for public review. And that level of transparency goes a long way in making sure that upfront, proactively, people act in the national best interests. So I'm fairly comfortable with the intent there. And my only question really will be the execution.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Christian, you have anything else to add? Or let me answer the question that's in the chat.
One moment, Yolanda. I see a question being asked about the quorum.
Yes.
Daniel Hutchinson, and the quorum is 7, right? Once the the quorum for the board meeting is
The
7.
quorum is 7, yes. And I'm gonna come back to the question after that. Christian, you had anything to add on in terms of the measures in the act to prevent corruption? You had anything to add?
Oh, I just think they're extensive. So I think it's all well covered.
Okay. There's a question here, Christine, how does, from Fabian, how does the individual prove that an offer was made under section 103?
I think you'll have to do a sting. You know, it's just like any crime, okay? It's any kind of crime is proved the same way, right? And once you're in the criminal courts, it's proof beyond a reasonable doubt, right? So if you think somebody's going to offer you money or whatever, you have to find some way of recording that. Nowadays with cell phones and everything, it's very easy.
Yes, it's true. I saw another question. Marissa, has there been any clarity or refinement in the process of assessing applications involving properties with historical designations, brackets listed buildings within the UNESCO site, the World Heritage Site? Has there been any refinement to the process of assessing them? I know that there's some regulations that are supposed to be on the way for the heritage properties. I don't know how far along we are with that, Christine.
No, we haven't actually worked on the subsidiary legislation for those parts, but I would say that the role of the National Trust, for example, has been concretized in the legislation, and in terms of the actual process of how the applications will be handled, I am not too sure of the details right now. Actually, as Yolanda will confirm, Sandra Penfield was more or less driving that process on that part of the legislation.
Yeah, I know it had started. I wasn't know how far along it had gotten, but it certainly was there are efforts to actually enhance those regulations so that we have criteria for determining what stays on a heritage list, what can be added, and what is it that makes it worthy of being added. I know that we are working on it, but I'm not too sure where it is at this moment. But certainly the intent is to improve those regulations.
Yeah, so not only that, but what we have done is going beyond what was the law before, is that we have allowed for clusters, areas of buildings. So before
Conservation areas.
Yeah, it was on a site by site, building by building basis before. Now, for example, you could have the whole garrison in one reservation, so to speak, in one declared area. So that the powers to protect the built heritage have been greatly increased here.
Yes.
I think one of the things that we were conscious of too was that in the past, people's properties were designated, but there was no obligation for them to upkeep those properties after. And we've seen many of the buildings in Barbados that were designated, some in Bay Street, for example, that were allowed to fall down. River Road, Bay Street, I can name 2 of them, for example. And we have avoided that here. We've put some measures in the new legislation that once a building is designated, then there's an obligation to upkeep, and there's some devices there to make sure that the buildings are kept as heritage buildings.
Yes, thank you for that, Chrissy. And the whole notion of having legally defined conservation areas is introduced in the draft National Physical Development Plan already, where they've identified areas. It's just the criteria has not yet been elaborated, but that will come in the regulations. Colonel Brown, Christian, anything to add on this respect to heritage properties?
Well, your mention of the physical development plan, you had mentioned in an earlier conversation that the physical development plan carries a lot more force with in the planning approval process now, whereas before it was a document that people didn't used to look at. It now carries weight in the approval process, and you know more about that. You may want to talk to that for a moment.
Yes,
that was Christine, you were right. Okay. Thank you.
Go ahead, Yolanda.
No, I wasn't too sure if Christian was asking you a question or if he had finished. I didn't hear the end of what he said.
I was just laying the table for yourself, Yolanda, or Christine to speak more to the question of the weight of physical development plan in the decision.
Oh,
process.
right, yes. Christine, the weighted development plan in the legislation has been enhanced.
Yes, yes, as I said before, you know, under the old law, the plan was there, but the only place that the plan was referred to as an instrument was there was a section in the development control process that said that when the decision maker has an application before them, they must look at the physical development plan and address their mind to the physical development plan and any other material consideration. So the courts have held over the years that the physical development plan therefore was only a material consideration. Maybe the first amongst many, but it was just a material consideration. But we have changed the status of the plan in section 18 of the Act. It talks a lot about what is the status of the plan now. And so there's a presumption that it will be given principal consideration when an application is before a decision maker. The board shall give principal consideration to be guided by the plan, but also that every public officer shall have due regard to and be guided by the plan in formulating and preparing public sector investment projects, and also any person exercising a power to grant fiscal incentives or any other form of public sector assistance for carrying out private sector investment projects shall ensure that the proposed project is consistent with the plan and has been granted planning permission under the Act. So the plan is given much more seniority as a consideration, I think, in the whole development process than it was in the past.
And just to add for a little bit more clarity here, I mean, we have a physical development plan dating back some years, and then we have this draft physical development plan on the table now. Does the draft physical development plan have weight?
Yes, well, that depends on the decisions of the courts, and the courts have held, certainly abroad, that a plan in the course of preparation, right, is a material consideration. It's not a plan for the purposes of the Act, because when the Act talks about the physical development plan, it means one that has been through the process of public consultation and approval by Parliament, right? So it's been fully through the whole process. And the 2017 physical development plan that Yolanda was speaking about is a draft development plan, but that doesn't mean that it is purposeless. It has weight as a material consideration. So probably if you were to look at that sentence, that you have to apply your mind to the development plan and any other material consideration, the development plan would come first, and maybe the draft development plan would be the next most important material consideration because you're in a transitional phase. For example, one of the things that was drawn to my attention recently was the difference between the water zoning provisions of those two documents. The 2003 development plan with its zones 1 to 5, and the new physical development plan with its zones A to E, and they're quite different. So I think, you know, both of them have to be, you have to address your mind to both those documents.
Colonel Brown, you had something to add?
No, I'm good with that.
But I'll just add in terms of having that, yes, as far as I know, even I think in the law here, I don't remember, but I think so. The plan on the construction or in process of preparation does have some legal weight. And the importance of having the plan as a forerunner, as you know, is that that is a broader framework, because the plan is also looking at things over time, past trends, current issues, and forecasting where you're going. And I know, Colonel Brown, it probably came as when they said it was included as part of the program, but a lot of change rarely takes place from at the national level. It's usually driven by international pressure. That's why we're doing environmental impact assessments. If it weren't for major disasters, some part of the world, nobody would change what they're doing. So as people start to talk about climate crisis and resilience, how are you going to do that unless you actually do some kind of integrated framework? And that is where greater and greater emphasis is coming. And I see it out of the 5 C's in Belize is coming on the role of integrated planning. And that usually comes in the form for us as a national physical development plan, which tries to integrate all the policies that are going forward, economic, social, environmental, and so forth. So it's very important, whether we like it or not, agree with it or not, that we take hold of some framework that helps us to see where we're going down the road. If not, we are still all working at cross purposes. So the weight of it, even though it's in draft, is still something significant.
Yeah, and I think you're touching on an important point there, Yolanda. After the Rio, of course, in 92, we had the global SIDS conference here in Barbados in 94. And coming right down, Barbados has attended many, many meetings, council of members of these various treaty organizations. And of course, we have signed up to many principles that are internationally acceptable. And we shouldn't be, because we are a small island development state, pretending that, you know, the global standards don't matter to us, because we are happy to go to these meetings and sign on to these agreements. And therefore we have to seriously try to adhere to the principles that are now generally accepted internationally, because you have written international law, right? Conventional law, as they call it. And there is such a thing as customary international law. And it has become a matter of customary international law now, that this whole participatory process, for example, we recently had the exclusive agreement recently in the region about, you know, having public participation and environmental justice. But it is actually acceptable as a principle of international law now, of customary international law, that you, even if your legislation doesn't talk about public consultations, you have to hold them.
If I could say though, I'm fully on board with that. I actually understand that, and I'm fully supportive of even of responding to international pressure. I just dream of the day when Barbados can take a lead in some of these things, as we have attempted to do in the whole question of renewable energy. That national policy on renewable energy is a global standard, however you look at it. I just think that we have the resources here to do that in many other areas. And in planning and development in a small country like Barbados with our kind of topography, I think it actually gives us an opportunity to set trends that other people will want to come and look at. And so it is from that perspective I was actually thinking, not necessarily that we should ignore what's happening internationally.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, you know, Colonel Brown, because I am of the view that people always complain about the limitations and difficulties of small island developing states. True. And I have worked in every Caribbean country from Suriname to Belize, Bahamas, back down, right? And I can tell you that I think we fail to recognize that one of the strengths of small island developing states is that we can do integrated planning much better than most other countries can do it. Because we know one another, we all have one another's cell phone number. So even if you're locked into an administrative system where you're supposed to talk to another department by going up to the PS and across to their PS and back down, it doesn't happen that way. And people do it laterally. And many of us sit on the same committees every week, wearing different caps, but you know, face to face with the people. So one of the strengths for me of small island developing states is that we have the wherewithal. We are better situated to do integrated planning than big states. That is a strength.
Agreed. There's a question about the implementation of professional requirements for draftsmen. I don't think that would fall under this particular legislation at all, but Christine, you can speak to that.
No, I think I saw something in the chat, but it's passed now, hasn't it?
It's just there. Will there be an implementation on professional requirements for draftsmen? I don't know where the draftsmen themselves are at with that.
I understand that that is being worked on under the Ministry of Works.
Okay.
That's my understanding.
Okay. Yeah. So under the Ministry of Works, something is coming forward.
Because one of the and we could touch on it while we are on that subject. One of the things that needs to be done, obviously, the question of liability and the increased role of professionals, registered professionals, came up earlier. And both the gentlemen who are on the panel with us know this very well. There will have to be changes in the legislation governing the professions, architecture and engineering. And those changes have been under discussion for some time now, and they're in the works. And I think, one of the problems is that I have been a little too overworked to get my head around some of it, but we get there in the fullness of time, certainly before they proclaim this part of the legislation. The engineers and architects legislation has to be brought up to speed in order to operationalize these responsibilities.
Thank you for that, Christine. Another question is the National Trust functioning? I believe it is, but considerably scaled down is what I understand. So it may be that people are, I don't know the number you call, but people are may not be there at the time when you call, but I believe it still functions as an entity, as far as I understand. Anybody has any update on the National Trust? No? Okay.
I would suggest, Yolanda, it may be like many organizations right now when the COVID haven't been affected in terms of its hours and personnel and, working from home and whatever else.
That was what I was thinking was happening. People are working from home some days, and so there's no one actually at the office to take the call. So it may be a case of understanding that schedule and then catching them at the right time. And then we have this one, looking back at listed buildings, properties or buildings reviewed for listing by the owners or government or the National Trust.
Yeah, there's a process by which it can be initiated one way or another, but obviously the owners will have a say, and there are lots of safeguards in there in terms of, it can be done behind your back, for example. You're very much a partner in the process.
I think it goes on to say, if not by the owners, is it reasonable to then enforce obligations to maintain as preservation projects?
I think it's very important that when we put those sort of things in there, that some facility has to exist to assist with financing. For example, I remember in St. George's, Grenada, which is also a UNESCO site, there's a special type of tile that they use on the roof of those buildings. Some kind of tile that they have to get from Italy or somewhere. And I think the government gets involved, I think, in facilitating something with these special materials and financing. So it may be that a window has to be open in terms of enabling people to keep up with their obligations in that area.
Yes. Any other questions coming? Oh, anybody else want to add to that? Christian? No. Any more questions coming forward? I see we have one observation, or to say, are there any revisions? Probably coming to you first again, Christine. Are there any revisions that you would make to the Act? And what would they be? What would they be, and why, if there are any that you would make to the legislation as it is now? Or same question I'm going to ask Colonel Brown and Christian, just to hear your views on that. Because looking at it, Christine, you can go first.
Well, to tell you the truth, Yolanda, I haven't given any thought to that because we're so busy now still trying to operationalize what we have here. There may be some wording that could be clarified and that sort of thing, but we're not into editorializing the text of the thing. I don't think that there have been any real problem understanding what the law is trying to say. It's written in plain English, not in the old-fashioned way. Was a contemporary drafting that we used here. And I think that the main problem here now is not really changing anything that's in the Act. Of course, if people come up with pitfalls that we didn't see, if in the practice, or you start to roll out, as is going on now, you start to roll out the legislation and you see pitfalls, then they will have to be addressed. But I think the important thing is to put our energy into doing the subsidiary legislation at this point in time.
Yeah, subsidiary legislation, yes, to give support. Christian?
Yeah, along those same lines. I mean, it's very early days. I think it's too early to say. There's still a lot to be done. We're at the very beginning of a transition stage. We're not even sure how long it's going to take to get everything in place and have this thing fully functioning. So again, like I think you had said earlier, I don't expect it all to work today. We're going to get it working as fast as we can. And I mean, the only thing, it's unfortunate that Section 44 has not yet been proclaimed. I think that's a critical aspect of the legislation. So I'm just hopeful, and we'll be available to do whatever we need to do to get that proclaimed.
Yeah.
Yes. Colonel Brown?
Oh yeah, similar comment. I've had the personal opportunity to be involved from the very beginning. I'm sure you had to raise Christine's blood pressure at some points during the operation. So I personally had the chance to have my concerns addressed not all addressed, but I actually even understand the ones that were not addressed. What I would like to have seen differently was the opportunity to bring a lot more of my engineers, for example, along, because I am now suffering what Christine suffered with me, and trying to get them to understand why some compromises were made and why some adjustments had to be made and why some things are different. It really would have been beautiful to bring everyone along. It would have been more challenging, but I maintain in the long term, it would have made a big difference. The only other thing that I would have changed is not the legislation either. I'm actually quite happy with that, is that I still think that big things like this need to be part of an overall change management process, so that as we moved along with the legislation, changes should have been in place to make these things come to reality, so that the department should have been adjusted. So I agree with Christian's concern that Section 44, for example, we're not ready for it. It would have been really nice to have a long implementation plan that included the point at which Section 44 will come on, at which time the department would have been ready, at which time the public would understand, and certainly the professionals will be on board. But we're moving in that direction. I have said before, and I will say it again, what my experience in this legal transition has been like, unlike anything else I've experienced in Barbados with these kind of matters, and I'm thoroughly impressed. I still think we have further to go, but I think we've done an outstanding job in this respect.
Oh, thank you, Colonel Brown. Kevin Brown, Kevin has his hand up. Kevin, do you have a question?
Yeah, I had a question, and I was just about to type it, but I guess my question is, I've had applications in planning take a year. I have one there now for 2 years, coming up to 2 years. And whenever this has happened, ton of countries' explanation is that it's the other departments, like the Barbados Water Authority. I mean, they're notorious in terms of delayed applications. Heritage Trust, the Prime Minister's Office, another notorious agency for delayed applications. And that's just the reality, right? But it seems that the new Planning Act will increase the level of bureaucracy on the government end. At least that's how I interpret it. And I'm just wondering I think an earlier comment from Christine said this is, or from you said this is all meant to expedite the process and make it faster. But I'm wondering, what confidence can we have that even with the new act and the whole push to go online, if there's an increase in government bureaucracy and the amount of drawings and stuff that they have to then navigate and stuff like that, what confidence can we have that the process will indeed be faster? Is my question.
Right. Yolanda, can I take that one?
Yes,
please?
you can. Yes.
Right. There was always time limits in the law, right? Under the previous legislation, town planning was supposed to deal with your application within 2 months, right? And under the regulations, I think it was in the regulations, they were supposed to consult certain departments, and those departments were supposed to get back to them in 14 days. It was the law, right? It was never followed. And when you ask them about this, they said, well, they're supposed to say, let's say the Ministry of Agriculture is one that was specifically mentioned in the old law and so on. If they don't reply in the 14 days, what are we supposed to do? And so on. They didn't feel that because the law said they had to consult these people, if these people didn't get back to them, they couldn't say your 14 days was up, right? Well, we've changed the law when it comes to that. First of all, the 2 months thing that the planning had, there was a clause in the legislation originally that said at the end of the 2 months, right? If the chief town planner needed more time, they had to write to the applicant and ask for the extension of time. That was taken out. So there was absolutely no punitive clause, except that after the 2 months, you could have treated your application of having been refused and then appeal it. But we know appeal was then to the Prime Minister's office, right? And that appeal process was a black box system. You didn't know what happened after your appeal was filed. So in fact, going by way of appeal would have done nothing to expedite your decision under the old system, right? So in other words, that system of 2 months plus 14 days and so on was completely broken because there were no consequences for not doing it. Now, how we've changed the legislation here is that we have actually provided for the consultation with the referral agencies. It's in section 28, that it takes place because all the expertise is not going to situate ever in one government department. You will have to consult drainage, you will have to consult agriculture, you will have to consult. But they have 21 days to give their advice. And if the advice does not come back in 21 days, then planning can ignore them. Okay, that's what we have provided for in writing here now. So they have an incentive to get their advice back in those 21 days, because if it doesn't come back on time, it cannot be included in the decision-making process, right? And then we have strengthened the deadlines, and we've actually put some very tight deadlines in terms of the actual decision-making process. And the only way the limitation period, and that is in section 34, we have a 12 weeks limitation period when you have an environmental impact assessment, an application with an environmental impact assessment, right? And that 12 weeks would run, of course, from the submission of the EIA report, not from the submission of the application. And then you have a 10 weeks for most applications, 6 weeks for simple applications. If it's a simple dwelling house, they have to make the decision in 6 weeks. And of course, the fallback is that you can then treat it as having been refused if you do not get your application on time, but then you're going into an efficient appeal process. So that at that point in time, you know, the deadlines that we put in the legislation are supposed to be more effective. It will take a little while. I'm sure that, you know, it may be shocking to some people to hear us say that a simple application for a dwelling house should be processed in 6 weeks. But why not? I ask you, why not? Yes, somebody's asking if the 21 days is part of the act. Yes, it is.
I think that, I think I saw a question there.
So that 21 days is for the consultation with the other agencies, not for the person to make the decision. But you could have gone under the old act after 2 months and kicked up a storm. I used to do it all the time.
So the question is there a timeline to review the pending applications that would have been in the system before the passing of the current act? Is there some a timeline to review them? And in other words, a timeline to get them out? Well, these many applications that were still there when the act was passed. I don't know if there's a timeline in place.
I would suggest that given that this act was passed in December, we are well beyond the 2 months. So everything in there is now beyond the limit. So
yeah,
it sounds like a class action suit waiting to happen.
but section 108, the transitional section, deals with dependent applications that were in the place at the time, right? And it says every application made under the former act that has not been wholly or partially determined as when this act comes into force is to be taken as an application made under this act. So the new deadlines will apply to those whole applications. And yes, you can go and say Christine Toppin-Allahar sent you.
Is it Tony?
All we can
what
do.
Happens when information does what happens when information does not come back?
What I would say is this: all we can do as legislative drafters and the Parliament and the minister and so on is to put the legislation in place and try to people it with people that want it to work, right? Of course, there may be people who don't want it to work, right? But there has to be a new culture of efficiency, of that whole drive to make a difference in Barbados. We don't want to be making those international reports as people who cannot get a planning permission out. I think we were down like to the bottom of the world, somewhere 80 somebody or 180 somebody in terms of efficiency in construction permits. We don't want to remain there. So we have to make that mental and cut that. But the point that Christian and I was making earlier, I think, is that, it was Colonel Brown, I think, that was saying that, you know, having done the legislation and I've got this nice new vehicle here now, we got to put the drivers in it. We got to put some gas in it, right? We got to put the fuel behind it, right? And that means really all those little administrative measures that have to be taken to enable it to work, that is where the emphasis has to go now. We can continue as legislative people working on subordinate legislation, but we can't do anything about public administration. So that is right there back in the bailiwick, I think, of the public service and the people who are running the public service to get things organized.
Yeah.
I would like to add to that it's not just about the public service either. We have a way of seeing things not working and then just complaining about them. I think as a professional institution like the BIA and the engineers and whatnot, and even maybe the planners, if we carry on seeing things not changing, I think we have to elevate it as an institution, as a group. We need to make it known and elevate it up the ranks so that we can try to get some change happening in the lower levels.
Yeah. Agreed. And we're gonna close off now with these last couple of questions, because in talking about the timelines and all the things that are put in place, I keep saying we have to put it in perspective that they're still changing over. So it's not that you can expect that overnight these things are going to happen. It's still going to be a little bit of teeth, and I think we have to be reasonable in understanding that it's a major change taking place and it's not going to happen tomorrow. Even if you go and say Christine Toppin-Allahar sent you, the fact of the matter is that the systems are not yet in place. But that's the aim of the legislation. And as Christians say, when it doesn't happen in a timely fashion, perhaps we need to elevate it and let it be known that these things, we need to put some timelines on it, but you have to give them a chance to actually make it happen. To answer the question about what happens when the information comes back, I'm thinking that comment is referring to when you send it out to an agency and you don't get the information. It's still possible for the planners to make a decision. That has always been the case. It's forever. Unless it's something very major and has a very major environmental impact. And in this case, now under this legislation, those things are filtered out very early. The thing that you're waiting on for the consultation for the drainage or what other issue it is, generally you have information from surrounding sites, surrounding areas, and you can make a decision without the information coming back. It's possible to do that without having every single note from every single agency that has been contacted. That's what planners do. Yes, Colonel Brown.
I think that's a very, very important point. And when I spoke about the proactive planning, the actual change that I see from this legislation is that those reviewing agencies in the planning departments, the intent now is that when requests come to them, it has gone through such a filter of professional review that, to be quite honest, what they are asked to do is to make sure that it has actually gone through the proper filter, that it has been reviewed by competent people, and therefore that it can go ahead in all confidence. And we can do occasional reviews. So it's a whole different way of thinking than to think that when something comes to them, they have to protect, they have to go through the fine print.
And start from scratch.
Or start from scratch.
Yeah,
that work is all meant to be done proactively.
Indeed, Colonel Brown, is important part of the pre-consultations is that the chief town planner or the director, as it now is, will be telling you what agencies you need to go and consult before you prepare your plan. So that the plan should have taken into account their thinking before it actually becomes a plan that is referred to them for sanction.
Right, so thank you for that, Christine. Now that we're ready to close, the questions become flowing very quickly, but we do have to wrap up. The question, timelines, to keep up with the application decisions when the economy is much busier than now will require the planning board meeting every day. Is that going to be realistic? No, that's not realistic at all. So we're hoping that the mechanisms that they have in place for the pre-consultations, etc., that by the time it's assessed and brought up to the planning board, that they can bring them in bulk and make presentations. So I don't know that it's not realistic for the planning board to meet every day. It's not.
But it's not necessary.
Some mechanism have to come together.
It's not necessary either, Yolanda, because
I wouldn't have thought so.
There'll be delegation. So there'll be a whole suite of different types of application that we can be dealt with in the department. So it is only, it's only a certain level of planning decision that's coming to the board.
And when it comes to the board, it's coming for a decision. The assessments and all the preliminary work has already been done by the planning department. So it wouldn't be necessary to meet every day. Neil says he's heard that the the town plan department hasn't issued application, hasn't issued approvals for the last 3 to 4 months, and when is the new planning board going to start to function? Like I said, you do have to give the board a chance to settle itself and get things in action. As a department, I believe the department is working assiduously to get itself sorted out and get the applications from before them. I can't say anything more than that. I think as soon as possible, there will be probably some public notice about where we're at with it. But I know that there's some outstanding applications that need to be dealt with. And I know that the department is trying its best to move them. So it may be that when the board meets, it may have to institute some timelines to make sure that the things happen. That may be the step, but the board is going to start to function very soon. With that, I would like to thank all of you for participating in the afternoon's discussion. I thought it was very useful. I hope that you found it so also. I'm going to pass back to Kimisha as she closes off. And just to say before I go that as Colonel Brown was talking about unpacking the many segments in the legislation and walking it through with different professional groups, the Barbados Town Country Planning Group had already started that process, and it's our intent to continue to do so. Once we get ourselves settled, that we will continue to break down bits and pieces and walk it through with those agencies and those professionals that would like that kind of guidance. So we will make ourselves available.